Hey everyone, this is Peter Zablocki, the host of the Daily History Shorts podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If this is your first time stopping by, I hope you stick around and return tomorrow for more fun history. And if you enjoy these Friday conversation series, you can always find the entire backlog of conversations with historians, authors, Pulitzer Prize winners, and much more under the Conversations tab on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Today's conversation is proudly brought to you by The Collector, your destination for captivating stories that teach, inform, and inspire millions of readers every day. From ancient history to today's defining moments, from philosophy and art to exclusive interviews, discover more at thecollector.com. My guest today is an award-winning historian, author, and expert on the American West, whose work brings legendary figures to life with gripping detail and cinematic clarity. Mark Lee Gardner is the author of acclaimed books such as To Hell on a Fast Horse, Shoot All to Hell, Rough Riders, The Earth is All That Lasts, and now his latest, Brothers of the Gun, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and A Reckoning in Tombstone. In this newest work, Gardner dives deep into the myth and reality of the West's most iconic gunfight, the OK Corral, reframing it not as a showdown between good and evil, but as a moment shaped by personal codes of justice, loyalty, and vengeance. Drawing on fresh research and his signature storytelling prowess, Gardner explores the bond between two of the most complicated men of the era, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, and the volatile world that brought them together. Mark's writing has appeared in publications like Smithsonian, American Cowboy, and True West, and he's been featured in documentaries on the History Channel, PBS, and National Geographic. A former park ranger and a lifelong student of the frontier, he joins us now to discuss how legends are made and why some of them still shoot straight through the heart of American identity. Mark, welcome to the show.
Well, hey, thanks for having me. I love to talk history. I know you do too.
So you have written about Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, and now in Doc Holliday. What draws you to these figures? And they straddle the line between legend and lawlessness in a sense. Like, what brings you to them?
Well, first off, they're larger than life, whether they deserve it or not. But also, all these individuals that you mentioned, there's some defining moment in their life, their career, that sets them apart. Whether Jesse James, of course, my book was on the Northfield Raid, and this very seminal moment in his career. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, the OK Corral. I mean, a defining moment. I'm drawn to these figures who are legends, who have become icons, and their stories are fascinating. At least I find them fascinating. But I want to get behind that facade, that legendary facade, and try to, find out who they were really. I grew up in Jesse James country. So, I grew up with the legend. In fact, Jesse James was a hero for me as a kid. We played Jesse James in the schoolyard. And that's why I was so drawn to his life. And I wanted to get, who was this real person? I knew the Robin Hood story, but what was he really? And I didn't want to do a biography because there'd been a lot of biographies. So I picked a seminal moment in his career. Now with Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, everybody knew they were friends. The movies all tell us, whether it's Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster or Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer, we know they're friends. Well, where did that friendship start? Why were they friends? And how long did it last? I mean, those were kind of the questions that I was intrigued by and wanted to get into.
When you were younger, did you always gravitate towards Western stories?
I tended to, because I grew up in Missouri, and my parents were history lovers, antique collectors, and a lot of Missouri is connected to the story of the West. Lewis and Clark start from Missouri. The people that go down the Santa Fe Trail, they're Missouri traders. The Oregon-California Trail, they're starting from Western Missouri. And, where I grew up, I mean, I was close to Independence. I was close to St. Joe, where the Pony Express starts. The first historic site I remember as a child visiting was the home that Jesse James was killed in. I remember it vividly. I was just a little boy, but we went through as a family. And then on family vacations, we hit historic sites and battlefields and forts. I mean, to be a boy and to go to those places, it was just thrilling. Cowboys and Indians and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's what you
Yeah.
were seeing on TV. And my parents were also movie lovers. So as a child, I'm going to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, those kinds of films, True Grit. We saw them all. So yes, my life was filled with these iconic images of the American West, and that's where we tended to gravitate to on these vacations. We went to Colorado, we went to Montana. I mean, as a child, I got to visit Little Bighorn Battlefield. I mean, talk about an experience.
Yeah.
And this open landscape with all these monuments, these white markers, in this plains filled with buffalo grass and sagebrush, and of course, as a child, I mean, what greater mystery than what happened to Custer? No one was left to tell the tale. Well, as an adult, I found out the side that won, there were lots of those that were left. They all told the tale multiple times. And that's what my book, The Earth is All That Lasts, is about, is the other side of the story, which is just as good as the story of Custer.
Oh man, a couple of things here because I mean I always drag my kids everywhere. Wherever we go, I'm always find a museum, and unfortunately, they're like, "Oh, Dad." I'm like, "Of course, there's a museum." I'm like, "There is a museum," but because that's what we do, right? As historians, so you get that from your parents, absolutely.
And I was also just going to say that, as an independent historian, money's tight. And so
Yes.
on our vacations with my kids, it almost always overlapped with research. So when I'm writing about Billy the Kid, okay, we're going to go to Lincoln County, New Mexico this summer. Things like that. That they're very familiar with that. So
And they're like, "Yes, Dad,
yeah.
that's exactly where we want to go."
Exactly. My daughter goes, "Is there a mall? Is there a mall there close by?" So,
That's funny. All right, so kind of getting back to this book, why do you think Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, and also Tombstone episode by itself? Why do you think that continues to grip the American imagination, perhaps more so than other Western conflicts?
that's a really tough question to answer. I think part of the reason is that you've got someone like Wyatt Earp who has come to represent the kind of penultimate lawman, and he's the ultimate white hat, and he's facing down these black hats at this moment of truth. I mean, and he's got his buddy at his side, he's got his two brothers at their side, and on one level that is extremely fascinating that you have such a dichotomy of these two forces, one good and one bad. And so that tends to stick with us. Now, that may not be the entire truth. That's the legend or whatever. And but I think what the reason it sticks to is that you know you have this moment of truth, and I know I've mentioned that several times. This moment of truth where you have to face down, you have to meet this opposition. You might die. It's going to be violent, but you can't flinch. I mean, it's kind of a moment of true courage in a way as well. And so I think at least the legendary, our view of it through legend, that's why it still persists. That you have the good and the bad, and the good prevails in this particular case. And that's actually the way I look at it as well. There's a lot of controversy, and people will talk about, Wyatt Earp, they were gamblers, and Doc Holliday, why was he even there, and those kinds of things, and you'll have the people that'll side with the McClary brothers and the Clantons, and they were actually legitimate ranchers, and they were leaving town and this kind of thing. No, to me, what there were many things that led up to that, but in the end, like it or not, Virgil Earp was the city marshal. They were lawmen, and there was a gun control law in effect. They weren't supposed to have their weapons, and Anyway, I think that the Earps and were in the right in that showdown. That's part of the reason too, Peter, why we are still talking about it is because it has become very controversial. Controversial history is still alive. When we know everything about something, that history's kind of dead. So if there's controversy, it's the same thing in a way with. I don't get all upset with people that want to say that Billy the Kid wasn't killed by Pat Garrett. That Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid. That's kind of the aura. That is what makes it intriguing. We're still talking about it. Yeah, it's silly. Brushy Bill was not Billy the Kid, but hey, that controversy, it keeps it in the forefront. When Billy the Kid's tintype sold for 2.4 million or whatever it was, he was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Controversy, news, history, the OK Corral, the controversy surrounding it, it's still relevant. We still want to talk about it. It keeps it alive.
Absolutely. Also, a perfect segue because this story, right, of Tombstone, OK Corral, and these two men has been told before. And yet, as I read your book, it felt so fresh and more relevant. I was kind of wondering if you could maybe share some of the angles and insights that you were most excited to uncover or share in your retelling,
Well,
as opposed to
yeah,
what was there.
sure. I mean, I did find lots of new information, and part of it has to do with technology, which I love, and I know you'll love as a historian too. And you know this. There's several newspaper websites that have scanned digitally historic newspapers. We have now millions of pages of newspapers that weren't available to historians 20 years ago or more. And one of the things that I found really fascinating and revealing. People, of course, went to the Tombstone Epitaph. That was one of the main papers in town. The other competing paper was the Nugget, and we have issues of those. But before the technology and the scanning, you weren't able to read a letter that was written from Tombstone that was published in a Pennsylvania paper. You didn't know it existed. So when I was researching this book, I found letters or reports that were written from Wichita, where of course Wyatt Earp was, Dodge City, Tombstone, that were published in other parts of the country. And they had good descriptions of, what these boom towns were like and some of the events that were happening there. So that helped me tremendously in providing fresh information. But there were also other things that were known, but maybe not quite as well known. And one of the things that really struck me about the gunfight itself was in the movies, you always see, all the participants are wearing holsters, what we call gun leather, right? But as it turns out, Wyatt Earp had his revolver in a coat pocket. He wasn't wearing a leather gun rig or whatever. Same with Doc Holliday. He was carrying a shotgun, but he had a pistol in a pocket. And it was so to me against what I've always seen. And, these guys always had guns in a holster. They were always very visible. So that was something that was new to me, and I wanted to convey in my book. So just and then there were other little things, and you might look at these as fairly nerdy or whatever, but it's these little details that can add to the story. And whenever I go into a project, whether it's on Theodore Roosevelt or Jesse James, I'm not setting out to change a story, but I do want to enrich the story. I wanted to add new elements. And so, speaking of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, a lot of this is hardly known by scholars, but they were doing credit reports on businesses, like Dun and Bradstreet. That starts in the 1840s. And all those Dun and Brad, it was called the mercantile agencies, the precursor to Dun and Bradstreet. All those books are at Harvard, at Baker Library. And so you can actually search. And I found credit reports on the father of Wyatt Earp, and I found credit reports on the father of Doc Holliday that add, just a little bit to the story. And they're very revealing. And not everybody you're going to find credit reports on, but if you had a legitimate business and some of these small towns, to just explain a little bit behind these. At that time, you're asking for credit so that you can have goods at a store. Can some retail or can some wholesaler trust this little store in Monmouth, Illinois. And so they're going to ask for a credit report. Is this guy trustworthy? The same way with the Hollidays in Georgia. Should I lend them credit? Well, the only way to know that in the 1860s and 50s is to go to the mercantile agency, which their whole business was providing reports on these individuals. So does that really change the story about Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday? Not really, but it just enriches about their lives and their parents' lives. So little nuggets are things that I like to say that I found throughout the telling of this story that, like you said, to help make it a little fresher and maybe a little more revealing.
AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
Yeah, I felt like you humanized them. You started like flashbacks. He's old and now he's thinking back, and it made it fresh for that reason. They weren't legends; they were men.
Oh, thank you. That's a huge compliment. Is that was my goal, was to do that. And one of the things too that struck me was that despite the movies, Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp were not that different from one another. I mean, some of the accounts, they were modest, they didn't speak a lot. The big difference between these guys was Doc's drinking. Wyatt really didn't drink. If he did drink, it wasn't much. Wyatt could drink a lot, and then when he drank, he got kind of crazy. He was this different person. But taking the drinking aside, I found them to be very similar in their personalities. So,
kind of going along with that, right? Do you think there's any misconceptions about this relationship or about the two men together or individually that you think kind of continue to spring up, but they are misconceptions?
well, one thing, a misconception and I don't even know if if I can give you the answer, but there's this whole thing about Doc's fatalism. Do you remember this? I mean, that the fact that he had tuberculosis, and then
Yep.
that led to the way he acted. He knew that he was going to die.
There's nothing to lose. Yes.
Nothing to lose. But then there are instances where he clearly wants to live. I mean, where he's willing to fight for his life or whatever. It's so. I mean, you can kind of see both sides of that, and I don't know if he really was fatalistic. But on the other hand, that's got to be in the back of your mind that I have tuberculosis. It's a fatal disease. And one thing that I noticed that kind of struck me is that, Wyatt Earp always seemed to be looking towards the future in some way. I mean, one of the things he does in Tombstone, he's wanting to establish himself. But one thing that I thought was telling throughout his life, Wyatt Earp will either buy a house or he's building a house. So he bought a house in Lamar, Missouri. He builds a house for his significant other. It's for them to live in Tombstone. Doc Holliday never buys a house. He never builds a house. He's either in a boarding room, or that's mostly he's living in boarding houses. That tells me Doc's not really thinking about the future. It's about the here and now. Wyatt Earp, who's a family man, is either buying a home or he builds a home. He's kind of trying to plan for his future. And even when he's jumping around later in his life to these various mining camps or whatever, I mean, he's always trying to establish or create something better. And I never get the sense that Doc is trying to really create something better or for his future. So that's the difference. And was tuberculosis the reason for that? Was it addiction to gambling that's the reason for that? I don't know, but I do see that very distinct difference between the two.
My kind of, I guess, last questions, although not last, but my, I guess, official last question.
Okay.
So if these guys are superheroes, right, you often would say like, all right, Wyatt Earp is definitely Batman, right? And you would say Doc Holliday has to be the Robin. But do you agree with that? Was there a sidekick and a superhero or anti-hero here? Or do you think this is more of like a partnership kind of thing?
I think that it strikes me as kind of a sidekick situation, in that Doc really looked up to and had this admiration for Wyatt. I think that in a way, Doc needed Wyatt more than Wyatt needed Doc. But despite anything that Wyatt did that caused a problem, that he did cause problems for Wyatt, Wyatt always went back to Doc saved my life in Dodge City, and he actually testified under oath to this. This wasn't some tall tale story. He actually spoke in the witness stand and said he saved my life in Dodge City, and we've been friends ever since. Bat Masterson never really understood the relationship, but he did say that Doc, there was more of a need and a fixation that Doc had on Wyatt than Wyatt had on Doc. But they
He
stuck
was the
together.
Robin. He was the
He was
Robin.
definitely Robin. Yes, yeah. To answer your question, he's definitely Robin. Um, and it's kind of, I mean, in some ways, it's almost kind of sad or whatever. And Doc needed Wyatt, but on the other hand, it's also kind of like the title of my book, Brothers. It's kind of a sibling relationship too. You might have a brother, and the brother's kind of an annoyance, and he's hanging around all the time. But you know what? He's my brother. I'm going to stick up for him, even if he's a pain. He's family, and that's really what their relationship became. They were like family.
Let's talk about the process here. What did you find most challenging in this research process? Was there a challenging primary source or archival discovery that you had to work through? What aspect of this research gave you the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge, in some ways, is Wyatt himself and the accounts that he leaves. Um, you know, it's just funny, but they've coined a term for some of Wyatt's stories. They call them Wyatt Whoppers. so the challenge for me is determining, what actually happened. Did it happen as Wyatt said it did? And I will say, more times than not, I found that what Wyatt recounted was the truth. But there were extreme challenges, and I couldn't even answer them in the book. Wyatt would claim in later years that he's the one that killed Johnny Ringo. Now, and for people who don't know, Johnny Ringo was one of the cowboy element in Tombstone, and the coroner's report, says that he committed suicide. But there's always been this suspicion that somebody else had a hand in it. Was it Doc Holliday? Was it Wyatt Earp? Wyatt Earp actually claimed that he killed Johnny Ringo in his later years. Now, years earlier, when he was in an interview by a newspaper, he said he had nothing to do with it. And the evidence of his location suggests that he could not have had anything to do with it. So why would Wyatt Earp claim to kill Johnny Ringo if he didn't kill him? I did come across one author. He was a very popular novelist in the 1920s. His name was Eugene Manlove Rhodes, and he knew some of these guys, and he was a contemporary of Wyatt Earp. And he said, lying is a coward's way out, and Wyatt Earp was no coward. He wouldn't lie. Why would he lie? He was brave. But he said, you know what? He could have been mixed. And what he meant was he confused. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, why he would claim to do something he did. And there's other episodes where he said something that just doesn't quite add up to what we can find in the historical documents, the evidence. So that was a huge challenge. But I will say, most of the time, the way Wyatt Earp told it, I found it factual. I found it believable. But there are exceptions to that. So that's the challenge. The same thing can be said for another challenge. Another primary source was Big Nose Kate. Big Nose Kate left recollections. And Big Nose Kate, as I say in the book, was a perpetual Earp hater. She hated Wyatt Earp because Wyatt Earp took the attentions of Doc away from her. She was jealous. So she was very negative towards him. But on the other hand, she was close to Doc, and she says some really fascinating, revealing things about Doc Holliday and what happened and when they were together, and some of Doc's background and whether he did this or that. But you have to wade through this minefield of hatred and just completely bogus stories. She claimed that they were married in St. Louis. There's no evidence that they were married. So that's another challenge with some of these primary sources. that are critical to telling this story, but yet there's problems, historical problems with them when you try to match them up with what we know, the actual facts, the newspaper accounts, what have you.
We always, as historians, glorify primary documents. We're like, well, this is what happened. It's a primary document. But, but just because it's from the source doesn't mean it's right.
That's
Right.
correct. And you'll remember from the book that, Kate, Big Nose Kate, she fingered Doc Holliday as having a hand in the Benson stage robbery. Well, and of course, the sheriff, Johnny Behan, who hated Doc and Wyatt, he just lapped this up and wrote out a statement and arrested him. Well, the prosecuting attorney later had to just dismiss it. There's no evidence whatsoever. So why would Big Nose Kate do that? Well, we know why. She was upset with Doc and the Earps or whatever. But even historically, she was making falsehoods. Well, what does that tell you about this document she left behind? That's got all this venom about Wyatt Earp and how awful his book is. She was jealous of his book too, that was published in 1931.
Yeah.
So anyway, you're absolutely right, Peter. It's most of the time, oh, I got this letter. It's perfect or whatever. And then it just doesn't add up. And it's like, well, what can I believe? And then you also don't want to be accused of cherry picking either.
Yes.
Well, why did you just use this part? It's all this other stuff is bogus. Clearly, she's not a good witness. It can be very difficult.
It's tricky to say the least. So you are known as one of the most foremost authorities on the West. If you had to think of, if someone said to you, I have never ever read a Western, whether fiction or nonfiction, I've never read one. And you're like, all right, you should probably read one of these. What do you what comes to mind?
Well, now you're putting me on the spot.
It's not the best Western book. It's just a book that you would tell a person you would probably should read this one somewhere.
Now, are you talking about Western history?
Yeah, let's think of Western history or even fiction. Even if you want to think of a fiction Western, novel or nonfiction.
One of my favorite fiction books is True Grit. And what I love about it, not just the story, but the language. This Charles Portis, I think, is the author. The language that he uses, it just feels so right. But another novel that I also dearly love is by Ron Hansen. It's called The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford. And, it's fiction, but there's a saying that, fiction may not be the historical truth, but it's an ultimate truth. Sometimes you can get to things in fiction that just seem to strike home. And I think Ron Hansen's novel does that. I think True Grit does that. And it puts you in, it takes you into another world. And it's the same with movies. There are Westerns that, you can find all kinds of anachronisms, but they put you in this other world and it seems very real. And sometimes it just feels right, the way that it's presented. As far as actual history books, I'm a real fan of first-person narratives, people that were actually there. And one of my favorites, it's a kind of obscure book. It was published around 1850, but it's called Watoya and the Taos Trail by Louis Girard. And he was a teenager when he went down the Santa Fe Trail, and he met Kit Carson. He met the Bitt brothers at Bent's Fort. And it's told through his eyes that just soaked up everything like a sponge. And it's his adventures, in the American Southwest, right at the time of the U.S.-Mexican War. And so I would always recommend that to someone as well. As far as a general kind of broad history, I don't tend to get into, I don't really like surveys that much. But I love accounts by people that traveled, that were actually there, whether it was on the Oregon Trail or Santa Fe Trail. And and there's lots of those out there, thankfully.
That's awesome. Mark, where can my listeners go to learn more about your work and purchase your books and all that?
So my website's markleegardner.com. And, I just tell people, buy the books at your favorite bookseller. It can be a physical store or online. They're not hard to find. And this next book's coming out in November, Brothers of the Gun, and hopefully it'll be everywhere. So it won't be hard.
Yeah, I'll make sure I put all the links to Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and Books A Million, all that stuff right in the description. So whoever's listening to this, you guys could just click it right on. So, Mark, that was awesome. Great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Hey, you're welcome, Peter.